my area of expertise as a scholar, as a legitimate scholar, is parasitology, and so I study parasites. I got interested in parasites in graduate school. A very good friend of mine studied parasites in sandpipers, and it seemed to me that the questions that he was addressing were big, global, interesting questions, and the questions that I had encountered up to that time seemed like they were sort of janitorial or cleanup questions, cleaning up after somebody else's good ideas. But the parasitologists at Oklahoma seem to have a monopoly on interesting things to study, and so I was just simply attracted to them and joined their ranks. So that's how I started studying that material. And I guess I would say that this writing that I do is an extension of my overall teaching and mentoring activity that ranges from talks to in elementary schools to the supervision of doctoral students. And so I think this business of being a scholar carries with it a major responsibility to involve those around you in your scholarship. So that's essentially what I try very hard to do. I think that the nation that supports scientists, this nation in particular, that supports the academician, I think the academic scholar owes that nation a literate population, and I feel a very deep responsibility relative to the society that I live in to produce well-educated, rational, intellectually secure, people who are not afraid of things that are new. Throughout all of my writing, there is this theme of independence and individuality and freedom, and I think that the things that I see around me, the events that I witness, the situations that I'm aware of, that seem to me to be contests between constraint and freedom, these are events and circumstances that attract my attention. I think it was on the dust jacket of my first book, Keith County Journal, that the editor, Tom Dunn, had compared me to Thoreau. Well, I had never read anything by Thoreau, so I came directly to this library right downstairs and went straight to the Thoreau and pulled out a book and opened it up, and just by chance, here it was, the essay on civil disobedience. So I read a little bit of that, and I thought, yeah, I agree with Thoreau completely, and closed it and put it back in the shelf. And that's really about all I've read. I try to read very broadly. I've read most of Paul Thoreau, not the original Thoreau, the modern American novelist, the one who wrote Mosquito Coast and The Great Railway Bazaar. I think he's certainly a model that I've admired. I think John McPhee is another individual that's very much worth studying if you're going to try to write nonfiction about anything natural. Speaking of Paul Thoreau, I went on a trip not too long ago and checked out his big thick book, My Other Life. I don't know if you know that book or not, but on page 297, I think it's 297 or maybe it's 296. I think it's page 296 or 297 of that book. Paul Thoreau is talking about being a writer, and he says something like, I need what all writers need, which is unqualified praise. And if you can't encourage me, then leave me alone. And so I copied that down and filed it away someplace. I was very fortunate, I think, to grow up in a family where my parents just simply admired everything I did, whether it was any good or not. And I would draw a picture, and they would say, "Oh, Johnny, that's a beautiful picture." Or I would play the piano, and they'd say, "Oh, Johnny, you just play that so well." And I know that that's not true. But eventually, the product of all that kind of treatment is almost an unnatural self-confidence, so that you're not afraid to try things. You don't, what's going through, you're not always thinking, oh, I might make a mistake, I might do something wrong. No, instead you're thinking, well, I'm going to do this because it satisfies me to do it. I mean, this is my stuff. And I think that anybody, whether a person is an original scientist and doing science, whether they're an artist and painting or doing sculpture, whether they're a writer or a composer, I think anyone who turns out anything that's original, any original work, has to have a certain element of that. They have to feel like what they're doing is okay, and they have to feel like somebody appreciates it.
Good evening and welcome to the Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors and the John H. Ames Reading Series. But tonight I'd like to introduce John Janovy. He is originally from Louisiana and studied at the University of Oklahoma and Rutgers University, and then came to the University of Nebraska in 1968, is that correct? 65, there we go. 66, somewhere in the mid-60s there. And he currently serves as the Varner Professor for Biological Sciences, He's also the director of Cedar Point Biological Station and spends many of his summers out there digging around in the field. And on 2 occasions, he's served as interim director of the University of Nebraska State Museum, which we fondly call Moral Hall or Elephant Hall. He has been called the literary son of Thoreau, if you have read some of his reviews. And you can see, he's been called that because of his observations of nature, and you can see evidence of that in his several books that he's written in the last many years, including Keith County Journal, Yellow Legs, Back in Keith County, On Becoming a Biologist, Fields of Friendly Strife, Vermilion Sea, and Dunwoody Pond. We've also prepared a display up here, if you'd like to take a look after our program, of many of his works and some of his artwork, actually, along with some of the other naturalists who have written here from the state. So I invite you to take a look at that after tonight's program. And there's also one picture hanging on the back on the wall. We didn't want to take that down, but you can take a look at that over there as well. And tonight he's going to share with us some new works that have never been published that are currently being worked on. We're all looking forward to hearing that. So let's welcome John.
It's always very flattering to be asked to do something outside your immediate area of expertise. In fact, it's really pretty flattering to be asked to do these kinds of things regardless of whether you're an expert at it, and I do appreciate the fact that you all have shown up. I think what I'd like to do this evening is read some material from a manuscript that my agent currently has and has had since July. I'm always very encouraged when my agent, who is an exceedingly businesslike lady and very sharp and very quick, and I won't call her untactful, but I'll say that she simply is right up there on the table. When she doesn't send things back to me by return mail, then it seems to me that maybe she's read something in them. And so I thought you may eventually see this, see some of this material on the shelf, and you may not. But as of today, I was hoping that I would have gotten some kind of a phone call today that says, this book has been sold, and so I could have announced that. But I guess I'm just as glad that I didn't get it back saying, John, I don't want to handle this. So, this is so y'all are sort of guinea pigs to see how people react to some of this material. This is a book that I've been threatening to write for a long, long time. It's an intellectual coming-of-age tale. It's about a college student from the Sandhills who comes to the university and grows up intellectually. The intellectual coming-of-age tale is a vehicle, really, for the examination of 2 or 3 other themes. And one of these themes is the sort of conflict between tradition and creativity, or between tradition and independence, and that theme is very strong in this book. The other theme is really the role of iconography, the role of the visual arts, and we are, in my view, becoming significantly more visual than we have ever been in terms of our communication devices, almost day by day. And all you have to do is watch television to discover that. So this is an exploration of iconography. And it's also an exploration of some gender issues, which I think today on a global scale are as interesting and rich a source of material as a writer can find, and certainly as a teacher can experience. In fact, if you read the cover story of Time magazine this week, it deals with that. The first short scene is really the literal truth. All of this stuff actually, in fact, happened. This is a work of fiction, but what you're going to hear now is the actual. It's a true event, with a couple of exceptions. This is a little scene that takes place after this particular student has told the narrator, who is first person me, has told the narrator that whatever he has planned to lecture today is not the right thing to lecture on. So that, in essence, has really not happened, maybe once or twice. But the rest of it is straight out of, is as factual as it can be. And there's physical evidence to prove it. She goes to her seat, halfway down on the south side of the room. I take the other aisle to the front then stand before the audiovisual console, flipping switches, adjusting volumes. I've made these adjustments nearly 3,000 times in the last quarter century. They've become second nature now, an assurance that I'm home, comfortable in front of an audience that I've failed on some days, bored on others, and thrilled only rarely. This child from the sandhills is watching me, waiting to see if her words have had an effect. Her face takes me back to 1970, before she was born. On that morning, I was standing at exactly the same spot, trying to present genetics, and failing miserably. Another young woman, who was sitting only a few rows in front of where this co-ed is today, suddenly stood up. I stopped talking. She obviously wanted the floor. She turned to the class and said, "This is the most boring and irrelevant lecture I have ever been to. My brother was just killed in Vietnam. We have to start doing something different. Maybe we could just choreograph a dance to mitosis or something, anything different." Then she sat down. There was scattered laughter from the audience. I had this depressing feeling that they were laughing at the fact that she'd called my lecture crap, which it was, and had completely missed or purposefully ignored her brother's death, or the suggestion that we choreograph a dance to mitosis. I was helpless. All I could say was, "I'm sorry about your brother." At the time, I felt some true responsibility for her brother's death. She was right. We had to start doing something differently. I just wasn't sure that choreographing a dance to mitosis was that something. But not long afterwards, a film appeared on the circuit. It was made by students at UCLA. They'd choreographed a dance to protein synthesis. A fellow teacher, who we eventually fired because he didn't publish enough research, loaned me his copy of the film, and I showed it in class. The different cytoplasmic participants in the dance of protein synthesis wore variously colored robes. It was a beautiful and magnificent film. It made you feel you were inside a cell and understood everything. At the end of the movie, I said to the girl who'd stood up, "You were right. We should have choreographed a dance to mitosis. We should be doing something different than what we're doing." Then we continued, in silent agreement in our respective and established roles. I talked crap, and she took notes. My only rebellion that year, the same year children were being shot on the sidewalks at Kent State, was carried out in an act of frustration. I went over to the wall to my left and made 2 chalk marks. The marks were on 2 bricks, separated by a third in a row. The row of bricks was my gene for intelligence, and it stretched to the next town west. The brick triplet was a nucleotide code for some amino acid. I'd been trying to convey an idea of the relative sizes of proteins and genetic information. Maybe, I thought, if I just mark on the wall instead of on the blackboard, the idea will stick in their minds. I don't know whether it did or not. Once again this morning, I've been told that what I've prepared is crap. The chalk marks made nearly 30 years ago still grace the south wall. They remind me that a young person's most outlandish idea was, at the very time she uttered it, being executed with beautiful results while I stood helpless in the face of her brother's death and a request for a new way to do our business. I shuffle through the transparent plastic sheets with carefully prepared drawings, carefully arranged in a sequence to tell a story of cell division. There is only one process more fundamental to life on Earth than the one I've prepared to present, namely photosynthesis, the making of complex molecules by plants using only sunlight and carbon dioxide. In my experience, if 300 kids ever looked like they could use an hour's nap, a lecture on photosynthesis will do the trick. Cell division is a close second to photosynthesis in terms of somnolent power. I look into their faces. The Sandhills child is as right as the one who wanted to dance. I return the graphics to their folder. Now, the vehicle by which this young person comes of age is a series of writing assignments. And the series of papers is really, this is sort of based on what I've been doing in the classroom for the last 25 years, and that is namely giving people writing assignments that are virtually impossible to do. I mean, they have no right answer. The material that I use for these things are things like the plants growing on campus or museum specimens, or sometimes I have these big sacks full of seashells and fossils, and sometimes I give them each a shell or a fossil or something like that, and then I'll ask them to write 4 or 5 papers with certain constraints, and the constraints mean, I think, that if they actually do the assignment, then they learn what I want them to learn. And so this young lady has selected a ginkgo tree, and the tree that she has selected is the one that is growing right now, right outside the museum, right outside Morrill Hall, planted in honor of Norma Wagner. And that is the tree that she is writing her papers about, and that she has to tell me why, and that she has to write about some of the things about this tree, and then she has to transplant it symbolically to the sculpture garden and remove a plant and justify all this stuff. And then she has to go inside the gallery and explain how her tree is an inspiration for people who've painted those paintings, this kind of stuff. You know. So this is really her first essay. So this is not literally true. This is me doing fictitiously my own writing assignment to this fictitious person. Tell why I chose the ginkgo in 3 typed double-spaced pages without once mentioning money, politics, health, agriculture, the military, sex, sports, or religion. What kind of an assignment is this? What am I supposed to learn by writing this paper? What else is there to mention other than the list of topics you've denied us? And why? Who asks why anymore besides lawyers in a murder trial? I've never done anything that needed an explanation. Never have I been asked to tell why I made a decision until now. And now it doesn't really matter what I've decided. To pick a perennial. Not literally, of course. No wonder you've given us 3 weeks to produce these 3 pages. I've chosen a tree. It looks like any other tree until you study it closely. Then you discover it has strange leaves. Most leaves are pointed at their tips or have jagged edges. The ginkgo's leaves are pointed at their base and gently flattened, sort of splayed out. They look like triangles, maybe arrows, pointed toward the trunk. Maybe I'm beginning to see a reason for picking this plant after all. Maybe you wanted us to find something truly unique about ourselves and our plants. Leaves that point toward the trunk are certainly alone compared to leaves that point out toward the street. The leaves also have tiny ridges on them. My textbook would call these ridges veins. I did something you told us not to do. I looked for information in the book about my plant. There I discovered that ginkgos have been on Earth since the age of dinosaurs. Thus I picked the ginkgo because it lets me imagine myself in a horror movie, with dinosaurs rampaging around on all sides and discovering a ginkgo tree and saying, gee, that's the tree I picked for biology. How did it get inside this horror movie? If the ginkgo could talk, it would probably be asking the same thing about me. Would the ginkgo think that the world I live in today is a horror movie? I don't know. But sometimes it looks that way, doesn't it? I have this disturbing feeling that maybe the ginkgo remembers the age of dinosaurs as wonderful, free, young, and exciting times. and now considers the age of humans a terrifying, crazy, out-of-control time. Also chose this plant because I knew that if I got desperate, I could always go to the library and find out if my choice was a good one or a bad one. I have addressed another why question. Yes, this assignment seems to be paying off already. I always thought you went to libraries because you could find references, books that would make your papers true. Now my book tells me that ginkgos have been here since the Jurassic. I don't know whether any of the other authorities in my life would have known that or not. Certainly my friends back home would not have known what the Jurassic is, but then neither did I before I looked it up. My high school friends would have wondered why anybody would want to know anything about the Jurassic. Suddenly I'm beginning to see a difference between me and the people I grew up with. I have a reason to possess a deeply buried fact about a world that disappeared 100 million years ago. But I didn't actually need that piece of information to write this paper. I discovered that I wanted the information and appreciated having my mind teased about the Jurassic, but could have written 3 pages without knowing how long ginkgos have been on Earth. But the very word, Jurassic, separates me from my home, from everything I valued and hated as a child, from my friends, from the only life I really know. The fact that I know this word, Jurassic, and have a reason to use it, cuts me off even from my parents and my little brother. I am different now and feeling suddenly alone just because of a single word. You also told me information that I didn't really need but decided I wanted after hearing it, a lecture on the structure of the cell. I suppose before we part company there will be a long list of other topics, just like that one, that I decide are worthy only after hearing them. Are teachers like books we haven't read? Your story about Linnaeus is like that odd fact about the Jurassic, something I didn't seek but found anyway. Is the Linnaeus story true? I could have taken the course, made an A, and never learned it. I am going to make an A. This is one piece of information you may not feel you need, but will eventually want, although you didn't come to me to find out if I was going to make an A. Or did you? Is that what you do for a living? Go to the young masses to find out who says they're going to make an A? Or do you cut us off from our parents on purpose? Is that what education is all about? I'm sorry for this digression and for all those unanswerable questions, personal comments about your grading system, and unflattering remarks about people back home. I suppose you get a lot of comments about hometowns. High school seems to be a major topic of conversation at college, at least among the people I live with here. But my first exposure to the ginkgo made me think unflattering thoughts about the people back home. Is that one of your purposes in giving these assignments? To help us wash away the lives we left so that you can fill them up with something else? Like those pictures you showed us in class. Are those pictures supposed to replace our memories? If so, I don't know whether I want this to happen. Let's return to my tree. I chose the ginkgo because I happened to be standing by it, and you walked by and told me a story. I thought at the time it was a rather dumb story and probably not entirely true, but nevertheless it livened up an otherwise dull morning. However, in all honesty, I did take a quick look around campus and saw no other ginkgo trees. So in retrospect, I chose this one because it was the only one in my world. Free. It was my symbol of freedom and individuality. Since then, I have found several others. Now that I've learned what to look for, I can see things I didn't see before. They look strangely different from mine, yet just as strangely the same. But they're not mine. They're in the wrong places. They play the wrong roles. Maybe wrong is the wrong word. They are different. They play different roles. Is different the same as wrong? Of course not. But then yes, all my life, different has been wrong. Especially back home, anything or anyone that was different was also wrong. For example, back in my high school, people think colleges are full of weirdos. What's a weirdo? Is a weirdo different or wrong because it's different, or different because it plays the wrong role, or wrong because it goes to college or doesn't go to your church? I don't believe I'm actually mentioning religion when I use the word church, am I? No, I've given that word a role other than the word one it would have had in everyday conversation. So I've not violated your rules. I'm just choosing an organization to illustrate the idea that difference can sometimes be seen as evil. That was certainly the case with all the people I went to school with. If you keep asking me to write these kinds of papers, you'll probably hear more about them, who were my loves and hates respectively, as well as my neighbors, than you ever wanted to know. These people all seem to have a pretty clear idea of good and evil was anything different from them. Sometimes I felt that anything was me. But then my friends also went to church a lot more than I did, and most of them were Catholic. in addition, which I came to feel was the surest way to acquire a strong sense of good and evil, as well as an especially sure way to acquire a strong sense of us and them. I guess I'm talking about religion after all. Feel free to take your red pen and mark out this paragraph. I'm way over my minimum requirement anyway. But then by doing that, you might end up marking out my best thoughts. That would be a problem for a teacher, wouldn't it? To mark out a student's best thoughts simply because the subject of those thoughts was forbidden. So you have a small problem. You didn't forbid a discussion of right and wrong, however, so I'll continue. Are oak trees different, or wrong, or weirdo? They can't be all bad. The squirrels love them. But then I guess no matter what kind of a tree you are, some animal might love you, especially if you just stood there faithfully, never going anywhere, and let him crawl up your side, snuggle in between your limbs, and nibble on your acorns. I'm out of thoughts and ideas. I chose the ginkgo because a subconscious voice told me I'd exhaust my supply of questions if I started writing about it. I assume this paper is confidential. You may show it to your wife, but you may not read it out loud in class. This is my private communication, probably to myself, but I'm handing it in because your job is probably boring and you need a little boost once in a while, and it's not often that a strange idea, a truly strange idea like your assignment, turns into a 10-page essay full of questions. But don't show it to anyone. Give me my 20 points and give me my paper back. And give me some help if you can. I don't want to end up like you, reading these kinds of papers for the next 30 years. I don't want to be a slave to some scheme that teaches me how to find a rich husband, and I don't want to be a physical therapist spending the rest of my life trying to rehabilitate injured high school jocks, and I don't want to marry a doctor and sit at home with his babies, but most of all, I don't want to go back to Carson County. I'd be happy at this point to entertain any questions. I have two more things that I could read. Actually, I have three more. I don't want to let this evening get too very serious and run on and on and on, and yet I want to give you your entertainment, your dollar's worth. Anybody have anything they would like to ask or talk about? Yes.
John, I'm really curious. Are the students able to really, at like 18 and 19 and 20 years of age, respond to those type of questions?
So what you really would like to know is whether or not this essay that I have written as part of this fictitious event is close to the truth.
Yes.
Can they do that? And the answer is some of them, you better believe it. You better believe it. Yeah, I've read maybe 10,000 of these 3-page papers. Yeah, and I would say maybe 200 of them are just simply stunning, and one of them was just simply so stunning that I sent it off to my agent and said, would you like for me to give this person your name? You know, the student may want to write a book sometime. This is a very interesting piece of stuff. I'd given them shells. Anytime I travel and I'm anywhere near the coast and a shell shop, I'll buy $5 or $10 worth of shells, little shells, and I collect the stuff, and people give me these things. And this was a paper where I had handed out these shells, and one of the assignments was to design 5 different pieces of jewelry using your shell, and then tell what statements you were making when you wore this jewelry. And it was a remarkable piece of stuff. I mean, a truly remarkable piece of stuff, written by an athlete on full scholarship. Yes.
What is a dance to mitosis?
A dance to mitosis?
Yes.
Yeah, mitosis is the set of chromosome movements that occur when cells divide. So choreographing a dance to mitosis would probably be having a number of people over here being chromosomes and a number of people over here being chromosomes, and going through the motions that those chromosomes go through as part of a dance, and ending up in 2 different groups and stuff like that. And it could be very remarkable as a dance. And in fact, that protein synthesis film was just you just couldn't quit watching it. Yeah. And it was, and those kids were out on the lawn. A big group of people were just out on a big green lawn doing this dance with robes. Yeah, they were great.
I'm intrigued you're talking about nature in the context of arts, the icons of jewelry or dance. Is that something that you've come to see as something important that you've learned from your nature study?
The question, as I understand it, is have I come to appreciate or understand the role that natural objects play outside of biology by studying? Is that a fair paraphrase? I think I think that all professional scientists see their work in a much broader context than they let on, and I'm just letting on. So I think that astronomers, for example, see the technology of astronomy. They see the history of astronomy. They see the sociology of constellations, the history of our study of the heavens. They see all of these broader aspects of astronomy in the world around them. I'm completely convinced that chemists are the worst of the group, and they see chemistry in everything. They sit down to mix a drink, and they see, ethyl alcohol and blah, 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 aromatics. And it just goes on and on. They're the worst. So biologists, yeah, we see it everywhere. I look around this room, and I see the plants and the still life and the sagebrush and the painting. And, I see all of this stuff. And you notice what people wear. You notice, and if you've been associated with a museum at all, and particularly looked at Aboriginal clothing of any kind, your first reaction is, well, what kind of a shell is that? Where did that material come from? And so, I think it's just a natural to all scientists see their work everywhere. It's just not all scientists use the fact that they've seen their work in writing popular books or making teaching assignments.
Picking up on that question, perhaps she's also getting at the fact, do you see nature as this ongoing dance of creativity? Oh,
do I see nature as this ongoing dance of creativity? Absolutely, yeah. One of the books that Vicki did not mention that I've written that has just come out in the last couple of weeks called 10-Minute Ecologist. And there's a chapter in there, or a section in there, about how long is short and how short is long. And in that, I talk about the ability of a biologist to see across time, to compress these various time scales. So to me, for example, the Jurassic is someplace you go whenever you want to go. Or the Cambrian, being an invertebrate zoologist, to me the Cambrian is very much alive and real, and it's not distant and gone. It's here and now, but I know that here and now is in my mind. So, yeah, the ongoing dance, if you want to use that metaphor, yeah, that's the central unifying theme of biology.
Maybe she's also suggesting a move beyond mechanism.
A move beyond mechanism.
Purely. Well, I don't know. I don't want to speak for someone else. I just wondered. Well, because you also were criticizing the age we're living in, humans seeming to be a little bit living in a world that doesn't seem to make sense or something like that.
Yeah, I was making a little bit of a snide comment about our world. Now, maybe I should come back and make a fairly serious comment about what I see around me as our world that may or may not have any scholarly validity. What I personally see around me every day is a world of images that we ourselves have built. They are not confined to natural processes. They've become disconnected from nature. And so in that sense, they are exceedingly artificial. And I see us, when I sit down and flip channels, I do a lot of channel flipping as a scholarly activity. I mean, this is not a power thing. No, I'm studying what's going on. Believe me. Trust me in this regard.
Sure, well, you're studying the media.
Absolutely. But I see us telling ourselves that the world is different than... I see us as a species saying to ourselves, this is a certain kind of world. And I see myself as a biologist looking around at that world and say, no, those pictures are not right. Those pictures have no link to the physical problems, to the biological problems of being a living organism on this planet. And I think that with the disconnection of the images from nature comes a disconnection of the mind from, we're not aware of, we don't feel constrained by those natural processes.
Right.
Yeah.
People have also said dissociation, same thing.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Did you use your teacher story to bring out some philosophical arguments that you want to say somewhere or another?
The teacher, the question is, did I use the teacher-student story to bring out some philosophical arguments that I wanted to make? And maybe I should tell you a little bit about that book. It's an intellectual coming-of-age tale, which means that in going through this set of experiences, this person grows up intellectually. And by growing up intellectually, that means you come to try to understand your world rather than reject it, rather than pass judgment on it. You're curious about your world rather than judgmental about your world. You're confident in your abilities to draw analogies, to use material from one aspect of our lives to illustrate another, to make metaphors. And this is sort of what I've defined as coming of age. The major, what I would say, narrative vehicle for this book is the interaction between this student and two that she went to high school with. And so the two that remained at home went to the Votex school at Sterling, Colorado, their whole set of experiences, and her perception of where she is intellectually relative to where they are. So they are the model for the constraint of tradition, and she is the model for the power of creativity. So that's kind of where that goes. The role of iconography, the role of what we see, images, whether they be images of trees or pieces of sculpture or paintings or what, that's handled very directly in the sense that she uses pieces as just very directly as literary devices. This symbolizes that, and this is why that symbolism is maybe not good for our society. This kind of stuff. She uses that very in the same voice that the story you read. The gender issues, I think, are much more interesting in some way, and they really tend to be quite American in the sense that we behave in certain ways economically, we behave in certain ways governmentally, we behave in certain ways in terms of our authoritarian structure. We are very formally, we're a very paternalistic society. So those issues are really explored also through these writing assignments, and that exploration is then brought into the light, or maybe I should say made more intense by the traditional culture's reactions to them. So yeah, that's about as, without reading the whole 350 pages, that's about as far as. Maybe I'm grasping in this narrative for the answer to this question: do the best and the brightest really take charge of the world? Do they exercise their leadership responsibilities and roles? And I've never been convinced that they do. And they've never been convinced that they do. I've given grades to some of the most brilliant human beings on this planet, I'm convinced. And I know right now that those people, for the last 15 or 20 years, have not, they have made money. And they have had a good, secure career, and they have provided for their families, sometimes elegantly, and you can't argue with that.
Well, of course not. Although you had this underlying critique there that you're really not coming on with it, where you're saying whether or not this technology is actually beneficial for our society. Because you're reaching back to this indigenous wisdom in the Jurassic and saying, can we connect with that indigenous wisdom that's in all of us? Are we able to reach back and connect with that in a way that we have some sense of meaning today in this world of images, of this narrative construction that you see as you're flipping through all these channels, wondering as the interest from the 1970s when Earth Day began to now, whether or not there's enough of a philosophical ethic, an ecological ethic that keeps us moving forward. That's your underlying critique of it.
But that's absolutely, yeah, you're close. I guess what I'm really saying in a more general sense is that every generation has a responsibility to cough up some poets and some philosophers and some thinkers and some Rachel Carsons and some Ralph Naders, and it doesn't seem to me that we're coughing those up very easily, you know. And so, and yet, going into a career, you know, for a young person to say, I'm going to be a Ralph Nader. Now that name is not necessarily received with you know, equanimity everywhere, but this is one person who, in fact, changed the way we do business. And in my view, cars are safer. You know, there's a whole lot of stuff that we do every day because of Ralph Nader. Our world is a much better place because of Rachel Carson, because of that one individual and her ideas and her words. And I guess my ideal would be for those kinds of people to bubble up to the surface a little more easily. And I don't see us helping that to happen. I see us maybe working against it. But I'm also a little bit cynical in that regard. I see a lot of good minds go off to get a good job and take care of their families, and you cannot argue with that. But I'm just saying, some of you need to be a poet, you need to be a writer, you need to be a philosopher, you need to get your brilliant mind up where you are a role model intellectually. 10-Minute Ecologist has just come out within the last month. It's hit the shelves, and that's really a book written for busy people in facing environmental issues. And it was written primarily in response to my service on the Nature Conservancy Board of Trustees, where I spent a lot of time with bankers and attorneys and people who did land business, and I felt it was sort of my obligation to try to teach them some basic biology. I think I've lived longer in Nebraska than any place else. To me, it's a very beautiful place. I think Nebraska, when people ask me, what does Nebraska mean to you? What do you get from the state that you use? You know, how does this state contribute to your vision? And I'd say I'm probably more of a Great Plains person than necessarily a Nebraska person. I get very claustrophobic when I go to the woods. I get very uncomfortable when I go to the mountains. I like to be able to see. You know, I appreciate the sky more than anything. I spend a lot of time looking at the sky. So I think it's the symbolism of open space, which to me sort of symbolizes opportunity. You know, you're not confined. You're not locked into something. You can look over here, or you can look over there, or you can go here. So I think it's the openness of the prairie that I personally tend to feed off of. Both of my parents died very young, and periodically my wife Karen will ask or make some comment about your mother would be proud of you, or your father would be proud of you, this sort of thing. And at a high school reunion, or my 35th high school reunion, one of my old girlfriends said, "John, you've done so well." At the time when I was young, I never really thought of myself as doing well. And now, looking back on 31 years as a faculty member at the University of Nebraska, and a good many books and 60 or 65 scientific papers, you know, this kind of thing, I find that people look at me differently than maybe I look at myself. You know, I'm still a guy who really just likes to go out and get muddy and dirty and catch some bugs and spend some time at the microscope, and I, you know, that's who I am. I'd like to close with something that's a little lighter, and this is one of my favorite pieces. When people ask you, what's your favorite? Well, this few pages comes real close. This is out of a book that I wrote as a result of driving down the highway with a friend of mine, and we had been out on a seining trip collecting fish for my research. And at the time, you know, a writer has to grow. You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, because you run out of steam, you run out of material, and you run out of audience. So I had been trying to grow by writing some fiction and was failing quite miserably at it. And so I said to this friend of mine, Bob Stark, who some of you know is a photographer, I said to Bob as we're driving down the highway, you know how guys talk out on the highway. There's this long string of expletives, and I can't get this published. I got rejected, you know, and this is not working. And finally he said, "You need to write a book about Nebraska football. Everybody will read it. It will get published instantly." So I came home and started writing that book about Nebraska football, and it wrote itself. And when I got finished with it, I said, "This is really a great book." And I sent it off to my agent, who at the time was employed by a fairly large agency in New York, and she wrote back and said, "John, I love this book. We're going to read. Everybody in the agency loves this book. This is a magnificent book." And I said, "Yeah, it's a great book." And 32 rejections later, she said, "John, I can't sell this book, but if you can sell it, I'll write the contract." So I tried a couple and then quit. This is a book about it's a piece of science fiction about the Oklahoma-Nebraska football game near the end of the next century. Near the end of the next century. And there are some things you need to know before you pick up on the subtleties about this. One of them is that this mother in this little piece, Nancy, is the anti-hero's former girlfriend. So there's a hero and an anti-hero, and this is the anti-hero's former girlfriend. And the young person in this scene is the hero of the book, and he is a tuba player in the marching band. And this comes very close to being a reflection of what happened with our own son, who was a tuba player. And his name is Charlie Robbins. And, oh, the other thing you have to know about this is that near the end of the next century, you don't just have children. You have to have a permit. So you have to draw a permit in a lottery to have a child, and that permit comes with its gender established. And, of course, having your child means cashing in your permit and some of this stuff. But Charlie Robbins is the hero of this story. And this is the story of, this is a flashback of how Charlie Robbins came to play the tuba. Nancy, Jack Alexander's former girlfriend, grew up into a very nice lady. She got married, and she and her husband drew a male child permit, which they named Charles and nicknamed Chuck. They were eager to start their family, so they cashed in their permit and had their baby. Chuck was a darling child, a lovable and cuddly little boy who laughed and cried easily, played with blocks and toys in his room for hours on end, loved to get dressed up, and sat quietly on Nancy's lap while she read him stories. Like Jack and Susie Alexander, Nancy also awoke on Saturday mornings thinking of football. But she wasn't pondering the mysteries of the game. Instead, she was reviewing her whole life, all the mistakes and disappointments, her dried-up marriage to George Robbins, her wasted career opportunities, but finally, inevitably and inextricably wrapped up in the madness surrounding Nebraska football, the one bright spot in her otherwise drab existence, Chuck. When Chuck was 6 years old, Nancy started giving him electronic keyboard lessons. He didn't like to practice. No little boy ever did. But Chuck did like to mess around with the controls, making loud, deep sounds. "Listen to this," he'd say. Then he made a sound like helicopters used to make, and Nancy would remember her grandparents' tales about the Vietnam War and some movies she'd seen. Or Chuck would turn up the volume and slow down the speed, and the sound would make Nancy think of trucks out on the highway. In the 5th grade, Chuck was a model student, and although he didn't get perfect scores, his teachers loved him. One day, a music teacher came to school and tested all the children. Chuck brought home a slip of paper that said he would be a good trumpet player and should start lessons on a horn. Nancy was thrilled, although she played the clarinet in the band and had hoped that Chuck would eventually do the same. Nevertheless, she was happy that her son wanted to take up a band instrument. Nancy rationalized her disappointment over Chuck's choice of an instrument by remembering that even while she was going with Jack Alexander, she'd been more enamored of a trumpet player than of the future salesman. So Chuck with a trumpet was not a bad thing after all. Nancy's husband, George, was an electrical engineer for the power company. His specialty was regulating the electricity that was released during the night. Consequently, he didn't go to work until afternoon and didn't get home until very late, sometimes in the early morning hours. He was usually sitting around in his undershirt, drinking coffee and reading the paper when Chuck came home from school. Then Chuck would throw down his books and get out his trumpet. He'd grown to love the shiny silver instrument. By the time Chuck finished practicing, George would be wide awake. "How many times can he play that same dumb song without learning it any better?" George wanted to know. "Be patient," said Nancy. "It takes a lot of practice to learn how to play a trumpet." "I guess we ought to be glad it's not a damn tuba," replied George. Nancy agreed. She remembered that tuba players were slobs who always run around half-shaven with their shoes run down at the heels. After 2 years of elementary school band, Chuck graduated and went to junior high. Nancy had great hopes for her son. He would eventually be in the orchestra. Then he'd graduate into high school orchestra and marching band. She had visions of him playing solos, backed up by the whole orchestra on Parents' Night. She imagined him playing in the University of Nebraska marching band, the pride of Nebraska. On the 3rd day of junior high, however, Chuck came home very late and obviously disturbed. George had already gone to work. Nancy was sensitive to her son's distress, made him some chocolate chip cookies, poured him a glass of milk, and asked him what was wrong. "I can't tell you, Mom," said Chuck. "You can tell your mother anything," said Nancy. She imagined the worst. Maybe he was gay or nearsighted. But she wasn't ready for what Chuck was about to tell her. He struggled, he cried, he ate his cookies, and he finally answered. "The band director says we have too many trumpets," he sobbed, "and if I want to stay in band, I have to switch to the tuba." Then he broke down and fell into his mother's arms. "Oh, hell," said Nancy, holding her son who would soon be too big for her to hold much, and thinking about what George was about to say. All she could hear was what she'd heard every day since Chuck had come home with a slip of paper saying he should take up the trumpet. "I guess we ought to be glad it's not a damn tuba." Next day, Nancy went to school to complain. She sought out the band director, a wimpy young man with wire-rimmed glasses who was not very sympathetic. A band has two real functions and one imaginary function, he said. The real functions are first to make beautiful music, and secondly, to teach the members to be part of a team, to work together, to learn to play roles willingly in order to accomplish something that none of them is capable of doing individually. Those were pretty profound words to come out of the mouth of such a shrimp. Nancy wondered what the imaginary function was. To play at football games, he replied, but didn't elaborate. Nancy remembered her own college band days and decided he was probably right. She hadn't thought about real and imaginary functions then, and she never cared whether the Cornhuskers won or lost, which is fortunate for her because they always lost. Never in Nancy's undergraduate days had the team won a game. She would like to have gone to a bowl game, but she knew that desire was only a dream. Chuck will make a fine tuba player. In fact, said the blotchy-faced little man, he'll be a lot better tuba player than he would have been a trumpet player. Really? Why? Because everybody thinks they know what a trumpet is supposed to sound like. Nancy was mystified and disturbed by this remark. She wasn't mad, not nearly as aggressive as when she first entered the band director's tiny office, but still she felt like her journey to school in defense of Chuck was somewhat of a failure. She wandered on down to the principal's office. The principal was a large woman with gray hair and steely blue eyes. Yes, Charles Robbins. She looked at Chuck's file. Your kids should be happy to even have a band to play in, Mrs. Robbins. This is a highly technological society. The truly important question is not which instrument to play, but whether to play at all. Then she ushered Nancy to the door. You're George Robbins' wife. Yes. Well, I remember George Robbins, said the principal. I was his second-grade teacher, a perfect student, a bright kid. Always knew he'd grow up to be an engineer or something like that, a productive man. Chuck doesn't appear to be as smart as his father. The woman shook Nancy's head. And I know how you feel, but it's better to learn about your children early, Mrs. Robbins. That way you can come to accept them as they are, not as you want them to be. She smiled. Not everyone can be president. Do or did your children ever take music lessons? Nancy asked of the career school administrator. I don't have any children, Mrs. Robbins, said the principal sweetly, but if I did, they sure as hell never played the damn tuba. That afternoon, Chuck walked home a different way from his normal... It's just not, it's not cool when you start laughing at your own stuff. You know? That afternoon, Chuck walked home a different way from his normal route. He didn't want his friends to see him carrying the gigantic, heavy, battered tuba. All the way home, he hoped his father would still be asleep when he got there. When he arrived, he tried to hide the tuba in the bushes in back of the house, but the instrument was too big. The bell poked out from under the juniper branch, and the sun glinted off the brass, sending a reflected beam into the neighbor's window. Inside the house, George Robbins was drinking coffee and reading the morning paper. Hi, Chuck. How was school? Where'd you get that dirt on your shoe? George wanted to know about his son's day. Hi, kid. Said Nancy. How'd you like some cookies before you start on your homework? Mom, I don't have any homework, said Chuck. Sure you do. Maybe a story to read. She gave him some cookies and pushed him toward his room. Then she started trying to figure out how to tell George the awful news. She was saved by the telephone. Call for Mr. Robbins, said a low electronic female voice. Who is it? Yelled George. The phone clicked on and a woman's familiar, sarcastic, prying voice came over the speaker. Just checking, said the woman. Is there something wrong over there? Hang up, Mabel, answered George. There's nothing wrong. Then why you got a damn tuba hiding in your flower bed, huh? Mabel laughed. Tuba in the flower bed? George rubbed his eyes. Off, said Nancy to the phone. George got up nevertheless and stuck his head out the back door. Sure enough, there lay the tuba, big, forlorn, and dented. Charles, bellowed George, Charles! And thus ensued one of those horrible times in the life of every family. No matter how blessed, no one can escape the ups and downs that come from being alive, married, with children, or in these days, with child or child permit. George Robbins raged at his wife and son for a while and then got dressed and went to work. Nancy said to Chuck, you might as well bring it in, kid. At least it's better than a stray cat. A kitten would be a nice pet. Tubas don't scratch the furniture, said Nancy. Now let's hear you play something. Chuck retrieved the brass monster from the flower bed, then sat down and put the mouthpiece to his lips. A wave of despair washed over Nancy. She looked at the coils encircling her beautiful son and thought of a snake, a giant constrictor that had come into their home, wrapped itself around their child, and was preparing to swallow him. The snake had driven a wedge between Nancy and her hard-working husband. She wondered if tubas ever caused divorces. Chuck took a couple of deep breaths and began to blow. A low, resonant, warm sound filled the room, and tears came into Nancy's eyes. She didn't know why that happened, only that it did. Neither did she know that tears would automatically come into her eyes every time Chuck began to play the tuba. Chuck tried the scale. Nancy's tears flowed. For the first time in her life, she was aware of the precision with which his small fingers worked the valves. The phone paged her. Call for Mrs. Robbins. Call for Mrs. Robbins. She let it call. Nancy lay on the couch and listened to her son play the tuba. What else can I... anything anybody else would like to ask? Yeah. Of course, I'm sitting here thinking of what happens to Chucky Robbins all the rest of this book, and it's not very civil, but go ahead. No, but our son played the tuba, and it became very... I've drawn on our children's experiences for material quite a bit. You know, Fields of Friendly Strife is really about our daughter playing ball, and this manuscript I hope someday gets published, maybe posthumously. I don't know. You know, at any rate, just listening to an individual play a tuba seriously, all by himself or herself, and especially if it's a high-quality instrument, is about like hearing any really good brass instrument being played because a person wants to play it singly. And so you hear things and come to appreciate those things that in a way that you might not if all you heard was the band or the orchestra. So no, yeah, he had a lot of big dented tubas, but they never ended up in the flower band. Thank you all very much.